I always believed I understood my son, completely. We had a connection that felt deeper than most mother-son relationships. It was just the two of us in that quiet house for years. He was my reason to keep going, and I like to believe I was his anchor too. We shared everything, or so I thought. One night, as I went into his room to straighten his bed, I noticed something under his pillow. I didn't mean to snoop, but curiosity got the better of me. I gently lifted the blanket, and there it was, an old photograph of me. A picture I had almost forgotten about, tucked away like a secret he was trying to protect. For a second, my heart stopped. Why had he kept it there, hidden? It wasn't just the photo, it was the way he had placed it, as if it meant more to him than it should. In that instant, something shifted inside me. A silence fell over my thoughts, one that I didn't know how to fill. I wasn't ready to give it a name, and maybe I still am not. But I knew something sacred had been crossed. We had always leaned on each other. He grew up without a father, and I did everything to be both parents to him. I never thought our closeness would one day blur the lines that needed to stay firm. But that night, I realized some boundaries, ones I thought were unspoken, might have become too thin to hold. If you've ever held something heavy in silence, know that you're not alone. Sometimes the deepest pain comes from the people closest to us, not out of hatred, but from a love that gets confused and misdirected. I always believed I knew my son. We had been through so much together, just the two of us, in a quiet little home nestled deep in Montana. I raised him on my own. Evan, now 23, had recently come back home for the winter holidays. Though he was a grown man, to me, he still felt like my entire world. We had always been unusually close. Years of solitude can do that to people. In the absence of a partner, a sibling, or anyone else to lean on, you build something deep with the one person who's always there. In our case, it was a bond that blurred the lines between parent and best friend. That night, the snow was falling thick outside, the heater sputtering as if trying to keep up. I wrapped myself in layers and made Evan a cup of tea. The living room was too cold to sleep in, so I told him to rest in my bed until it warmed up. He didn't protest. His face was pale, his eyes tired. Without a word, he climbed in. I pulled the heavy blanket up over his shoulders, the same way I had when he was just a boy. As I fluffed his pillow, I felt something stiff beneath the fabric. Curious, I lifted it slightly, expecting to find maybe a notebook or his phone. But instead, my fingers wrapped around a photo. A photo of me. It was taken years ago, one of those old glamour portraits from my mid-20s. I was wearing a dark green velvet dress I hadn't thought about in years. The edges of the photo were worn, the colors faded slightly, but it had clearly been kept safe. Hidden, tucked under his pillow like a quiet confession. My breath caught. He was already asleep, or at least pretending to be. I stared at the picture, unsure what to feel. Why would he keep this? And why here? Without saying anything, I slid the photo back where I found it. I didn't want him to know I had seen it. Still, something inside me shifted in that moment. A weight, or maybe a realization, settled quietly over me. The room was dim, bathed in the soft glow spilling from the hallway. The scent of peppermint tea and old wood filled the air. I told myself I'd lie beside him only for a little while, just until the living room warmed up. But as I lay there, listening to the quiet creaks of the house and his slow, steady breathing, something unspoken hung between us. And in that silence, I could no longer ignore the boundaries we had allowed to blur. Evan didn't move at first. His breathing was slow and steady, his back turned slightly toward me. I assumed he was asleep, maybe shifting for warmth. But then, I felt his arm lightly brush against mine, and it stayed there. A small, almost harmless gesture, but I noticed it. A few quiet minutes passed. The space between us seemed to disappear. I could feel the warmth of his body through the blanket, not from the cold, but something else that stirred deeper. He shifted again, his leg gently touching mine. I didn't move, not out of fear, but because I didn't quite know what I was feeling. I stared up at the ceiling, my heart steady but unsure. Then, I felt his hand near mine, resting close, not holding. Not reaching, just there. It reminded me of when he was younger, maybe 6 or 7, and would climb into bed during storms, clinging to me for comfort. He'd hide his face in my shoulder, trembling, needing the safety only a mother could offer. But this wasn't the same. I turned my head slightly to look at him. His eyes were open, and they were looking right at me. There was no fear in them, only something quiet and searching, like he was waiting for me to say something, to offer some kind of response. My throat tightened. I wanted to break the moment with a laugh, a word, anything to return us to safer ground. But nothing came, only the silence, deep and humming between us. So I closed my eyes, hoping to push away whatever strange pull was in the air. And then, memory came rushing in. It was another winter night, years ago. Evan had been just 9. I was working the night shift at the hospital when they called me in unexpectedly. I almost said no, we needed the money, so I went. But hours later, my phone buzzed. It was the school nurse. Evan had collapsed at daycare with a high fever. 103. I didn't wait for approval or explanation. I left in a panic, running through falling snow in my scrubs, my coat barely zipped, my hair soaked with melting flakes. That night, as I carried him through the doors, I remember thinking I'd never forgive myself if anything happened to him. He was everything, my only reason for waking up, for pushing through every lonely day. I swore I'd always protect him, love him, keep him safe. Now here we were, years later. In that same kind of quiet, but everything had shifted. I didn't know what Evan was feeling, or if he even understood it himself. Maybe it was the years of closeness, of sharing too much space and not enough outside love. Maybe it was the weight of unspoken grief or just misplaced comfort. Whatever it was, I knew I had to be the one to hold the boundary steady. Because love can take many forms, but not all are meant to be acted on. And not all closeness is healthy, even if it feels gentle in the moment. I never even clocked out that night at the hospital. I held Evan for hours, his small body limp against mine, his skin hot to the touch. I kept a cool washcloth pressed to his forehead while a bowl of soup went untouched on the tray beside us. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I just sat there listening to his breathing, willing him to be okay. That night, I remember making a silent promise, I would never leave him alone again. Our closeness grew out of nights like that, nights filled with fear, sacrifice, and an overwhelming kind of love that only a mother can understand. I poured everything I had into raising him, and in doing so, I had made him my entire world. But now, lying beside him all these years later, something felt different. There was something hanging in the air between us. A thread of tension I didn't know how to name. I couldn't tell if it came from him or from me, or maybe from the space we had always filled with unspoken things. I just knew it was there. The next morning was quieter than usual. Evan was gone by the time I opened my eyes. The bed was perfectly made, too perfect. As if he'd tried to erase any trace of what had happened, or what hadn't. I busied myself with laundry, picked up empty mugs, straightened pillows. As if tidying the house could also tidy the strange silence that had grown between us overnight. Then I found his hoodie, draped over the back of the chair. It was still warm, like he'd just taken it off a few minutes before. I reached for it, and as I did, something small and square slipped from the front pocket and landed softly on the carpet. A journal. I froze, giving myself a moment to consider whether I should just leave it there. But I didn't. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands. It was a small leather notebook, barely used. I flipped through the pages, most of them were blank. Then halfway through, I saw his handwriting. Slanted, neat, thoughtful. Evan always had tidy writing. One line caught my eye. Sometimes I feel like Mom is the only one who gets me. I smiled faintly at first, touched. But then I kept reading, and the next line stopped me cold. But this closeness, it scares me. I stared at the words. My chest tightened. It's too much sometimes, he'd written. Like I can't breathe, and I don't know how to say any of it, not even to her. I sat down at the edge of the bed, the journal open on my lap. I read the passage again, slower this time, as if the words might change if I gave them more room. But they didn't. They stayed exactly the same. Evan was afraid, not of me, exactly, but of what we had become, of how deeply we were entangled. And suddenly, I realized, so was I. Not of me, but of something between us. Something unspoken, unnamed, yet undeniably present. I had felt it too. What happened the night before wasn't a strange, isolated moment. It was a ripple from something deeper. A bond that had slowly, over time, twisted into a shape neither of us could recognize anymore. The sun hung low that afternoon, casting a pale light that barely pushed through the frost on the windows. I was still holding the journal, fingers curled around its edges, when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me, not because it was loud, but because it pulled me so suddenly out of my thoughts. Like a tug on a thread already close to breaking. I tucked the journal into a drawer and answered the door. Walter stood there, smiling with his usual calm warmth, tugging off one of his gloves. "Heard from the Johnsons your heater's acting up again," he said. "Thought I'd swing by and see if you needed a hand." Walter had lived next door for over 20 years. He was in his late 50s now, quiet and kind, widowed early. He and my late husband, Charles, had been close: fishing trips, game nights, quiet Sunday football. The sort of friendship men don't always talk about, but feel deeply. Since Charles passed, Walter had been present but never intrusive. A respectful presence. Someone who seemed to understand that grief had its own gravity. I nodded. "Yeah, it's clanking again. Probably that same valve as last time." He stepped inside, brushing snow from his boots, and made his way down to the basement with the familiarity of someone who had done this before. Just then, Evan appeared at the end of the hallway. He and Walter exchanged a glance, brief, polite, but stiff. Evan said nothing, just leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. I followed Walter downstairs for a moment, talking about the usual things: old wiring, the bitter cold creeping in earlier than usual this year, Montana weather, the kind of conversation that fills space but doesn't really say much. But even down there, I could feel Evan's presence upstairs. It was like static in the walls. Watching, listening, waiting. When we returned to the kitchen, I poured Walter a cup of coffee. We sat across from each other at the table, steam curling between us, slow and silent. "So," Walter said at last, his voice soft, his eyes fixed on the mug between his hands. "How's Evan doing?" There was weight in the question. It wasn't small talk. Not this time. "He's quiet," I said, stirring cream into my cup. "More than usual." Walter nodded, slowly. Then he looked up. His eyes met mine with something more than concern. There was knowing in them. Not judgment, just something heavier than the air between us. I suddenly felt caught, like I was standing between two versions of myself. The mother I had always been, and something else. Something I hadn't wanted to admit I was becoming. Evan's look from the hallway was still fresh in my mind. The silence he left in his wake clung to everything in the room. And Walter, he knew something. He didn't say it aloud, but I could see it in his eyes. It was just past 7 when he returned the next evening. The heater was already humming along just fine, clearly fixed. But he claimed he wanted to check it one more time. I knew better. This wasn't about pipes or parts. It never was. We found ourselves back at the kitchen table. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was thick, weighted by everything left unsaid. Evan wasn't home. He'd gone out for a walk, or at least that's what he told me. The house finally felt still. Walter cleared his throat, his voice softer than usual when he began. "I almost didn't come back tonight." I looked up, watching him. He wasn't touching his coffee this time. I didn't want to say anything out of line, he continued, eyes trained on the wood grain of the table. "But I've seen things, Marilyn. Not all at once. Just little pieces. Moments." He paused, then leaned forward ever so slightly. "I think you know what I mean." I swallowed hard. The silence between us pulsed like a wound we'd both ignored for far too long. "I'm not judging," he added quickly, sensing my discomfort. "God knows I'm not. I've lost someone too. I know what loneliness does." His fingers traced the rim of the mug absently, as though grounding himself in the motion. Then, softer than before, he said, "You've always been strong. But I've seen how he looks at you, and I've seen the way you carry that weight alone." I didn't respond. I couldn't. "I care about you," he said, his voice steady. "Always have. But I stepped aside because you had your hands full. And because, maybe part of me knew you wouldn't let anyone else in." His words didn't accuse. They just settled in the room, gently, but undeniably. Walter had seen it. The tension, the confusion, and maybe even the danger that lived quietly between me and Evan. Evan came home not long after Walter left. He didn't ask who had been here. He didn't have to. The silence that wrapped around us wasn't the old, tired kind anymore. It was something new, the stillness that arrives just before something important is finally said. He stood in the hallway, eyes searching mine, like he was waiting for permission. I nodded toward the couch. He sat down first. I followed, keeping just enough space between us. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then softly, his voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I saw you with Walter." I inhaled slowly, careful not to read too much into his tone. "Yeah," I said. He stopped by to check on the heater. Evan nodded, his jaw tight. Then, after a beat, "I don't like the way he looks at you." The words fell between us like a stone in still water. I felt the ripples instantly. Evan, I said gently, he's an old friend. He's been around for a long time. I know, he whispered. That's the problem. His voice cracked, not with anger, but with something more vulnerable. He looked down at his hands, like he didn't know what they were supposed to do anymore. That's the problem, he said, his voice cracking, not from anger, but from something raw and tangled. He looked down at his hands like he didn't quite recognize them. I don't know what's happening to me, he murmured. I feel like you're all I've got. And when I see someone else getting close to you, it makes me feel like I'm disappearing. I leaned forward, heart tight but steady. I know you feel that way, I said gently. But I can't be the only place you turn. That's not fair, to you or to me. He blinked quickly, his jaw set, eyes glassy. Then, almost a whisper, I don't want to lose you. You won't, I said softly. But we have to make space, so we can both breathe again. He nodded slowly, and something in him seemed to loosen, not completely, but enough. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, I felt a shift. Like we were finally standing on the same ground again. Not as a child and the mother who'd held his whole world together, but as two people, trying to learn how to let go without falling apart. The days that followed weren't perfect. Nothing was solved overnight, but something in the atmosphere had softened. There was less bracing, less walking on eggshells. A little more air between us, and in that air, space to heal. I began seeing a therapist. Quietly, no dramatic turning point, no announcement. Just once a week, sitting across from someone trained to help me unspool the knots I hadn't realized had been building for years. We talked about grief, about boundaries, about the kind of loneliness that accumulates so slowly you don't notice it's strangling you until someone else enters the room and you flinch. I didn't tell Evan right away. But when I finally did, he only nodded and said, I think that's good, Mom. There was no resistance in his voice. Just acceptance, maybe even relief. Soon after, Evan told me he was returning to campus. He'd found a winter housing program and said he was ready to be on his own again, for a while. I didn't protest. I didn't try to hold him back. I simply said, I'm proud of you, and meant it. We started talking about the everyday things again, laundry, groceries, Netflix shows. But something was different. There was space now. Not silence. Not avoidance. Just space that let each of us breathe without guilt. The night before Evan left, he hugged me in the kitchen. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't confused. It was warm, and real, and in that quiet, I realized, I could breathe again. So could he. Sometimes, love isn't about holding on for dear life. It's about learning when, and how, to let go, gently, with care. We talk about boundaries like they're walls. But really, they're doors. You don't build them to keep love out. You build them to protect what's sacred, and to open up only when it's safe, when it's right. Looking back now, I understand. Grief had reshaped us both. I gave too much. He clung too tightly. And somewhere in the middle, love got blurry. But healing doesn't begin with clarity. It begins with a breath. A pause. The courage to whisper, I need help. If you've ever loved someone so deeply it scared you. If you've ever wondered if love alone was enough. Just know, you're not broken. You're human. And humans heal. Thank you, truly, for walking through this vulnerable journey with me. Whether you stayed for the whole story or just a piece of it, your presence here matters. These aren't just stories, they're bridges. And maybe, today, we crossed one together. Disclaimer. This is a fictional narrative crafted to explore complex emotional themes, such as grief, boundaries, and the transformation of relationships. While inspired by real human experiences, any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, is purely coincidental. If you're experiencing emotional distress or navigating a difficult relationship, please consider reaching out to a qualified therapist or support network.